All right, everyone, welcome. Our entry song was NLAH Take Two by Pineal Gland Entertainment. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I'm so grateful to all our panelists for taking the time to come today and for everyone for joining. I know that so many of us have been reaching out for language that helps us understand this moment in a long history of protesting state violence against Black people. For some of this is our first time engaging with protests, and for others, our lived experiences contain many memories of those who fought long before. Today is the birthday of Breonna Taylor, and she was supposed to be 27 today. We celebrate her life and the lives of other names that we know, and the many names that we will never know. Today, we'll be focusing on nonviolent sides of movement actions. These are the folks that I have always gone to in these moments, so thank you all. I deliberately called this a round table instead of a panel because I think all of us have grown as a result of collaboration with each other. And having these really tough conversations around what it means to seek liberation is what drives all our work, and it really brings our dialogue to a higher level. Before we begin, I have a warning for everybody. This group laughs a lot. And so if you're listening with earphones, I don't know how to help you with the volume game because when we laugh with our whole chests. And this group also just, we talk about really serious issues, but, we're all friends. And so we're going to roast each other. And this is just how it's going to go. So let me introduce everybody, and y'all can unmute and wave as I introduce you. First, we have Stephanie Jones, who is a PhD candidate in sociology.
I like their whole chest, huh?
Yes. PhD candidate. She just defended recently, so we're all very proud of her. We have Rod Martinez, who is a PhD student in sociology. Hello. We have Chaz Brisco, who is a PhD student in political science. And we have Doctor. Let me say it again for the people in the back. We have Dr. Devon Wright, PhD in sociology.
Hello, beautiful people. Hello.
Thank you. And last but certainly not least, we have Antwann Simpkins, who is a PhD student in sociology. All right, folks. Thank you all so much for coming. Does everyone feel comfortable going on a first name basis for this?
Yeah, for sure.
Yes.
All right, if anybody needs to be called Professor So-and-so, I'm more than happy to oblige. If that's what you need to feel comfortable, that's fine. Okay, so we're just gonna jump right into it. We have 6 questions and we're gonna aim for an hour and a half. So let's do our best on that front. Okay, the first question I have for y'all is, what is political change? We talk about this a lot. People put their whole dissertations into this, their whole life's work into this. How can we frame political change for people who don't know?
Professor Brisco. Okay.
Yeah. Oh, is that my cue?
I'm like, that's a political scientist question.
I mean,
right.
I told y'all, for everyone watching, it took no
I
time
was
at
like,
all for
oh,
us
so
to get
that's my
into
cue
this.
to jump. Got it. Here we go. All right, cool. No, so yeah, I'm gonna already say I've thought about all these things beforehand. And the first things that immediately jumped off, kind of jumped into my mind when I was thinking a redistribution of material resources. If I want to talk about political change, it's like, so what is politics, right? And so in politics, we're always talking about the management, the process, right, of how we distribute resources, right? I mean, I think the old hack that we always say is like the who, when, where, what, how, right, of like how decision making is actually done. So for me, right, it would be a redistribution then of power, then, right, like who gets to make those decisions.
Mm-hmm.
And then, again, like kind of what Steph has been saying all week and what she's really has kind of stuck in my mind, right, is then also, this all power to all people, right? And so this conversation of what would radical democracy look like then as well, right? If we want to talk about political change, it's like, cool. So then that redistribution will look like folks having power in their hands, some sort of radical democratic platform or whatever, however that manifests. So, those are my thoughts, just off topic.
Amazing.
Yeah, I'm just thinking.
Yeah, I mean, I think if I can follow that just a little bit, a lot of the discourse around political change usually leans on and sometimes largely only relies on political change that reflects some kind of legal action, right? So we're always looking for some kind of like legislative change, or we're looking for like a different person to be put into a seat or a leadership position. And that, to a lot of people, is the only kind of like political change that seems like real or material. But I think sort of like one of the things that I've been pressing people, especially some of my students, to sort of like tangle with is, what about political change that's around discourse, right? The need or ability to request something, the like imaginary sort of things that we want even politicians to be fighting for, right? How do we work outside of our legislative / leadership position sort of thinking and framework? And a lot of times people sort of downplay those things as sort of not, there's two sides. There's one side where it's like, this isn't a realistic possibility, like those types of political changes aren't realistic. But B, there's also the side of like, well, if we're not fighting for something that's legislative, then it's not worth it to even imagine working outside of these boxes.
Right. Steph, I think there's something to it. There's been this like tweet going around, right, talking about one of the Civil Rights Act that we passed, and it basically goes along the lines of MLK was assassinated, folks, caused something like $47 million in damage, right? Is that what it was? Some large amount, and then on the 6th day of unrest that included violence, then the Civil Rights Act was passed, right? And it's sort of being promoted as like the ergo all violence and all actions work, right?
Yeah, and I mean, I'm sure Devon can probably speak to this more, but I mean, when we talk about sort of social movement actions and like how we measure success, or like, sort of like imagine what success looks like. I mean, even thinking about the Civil Rights Bill as a success in the civil rights movement is incredibly limiting. I mean, there's so many other successes that were included in that movement.
Should we talk about how this whole thing began, like this whole democratic experiment began? The United States itself.
Let's do it.
Yes,
Roasting the United States.
If we're trying to come up with, I guess, with a standard of success, a good case study for, where violent protest produces a positive outcome, perhaps we should begin with, the 1770s here in the United States.
Hot take.
Boston Tea Party, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, flipping over shit, like Jesus.
Literally chasing folks out of a temple with.
Yeah, dumping tea into the Boston Harbor, right?
Right, and that is a form of political change, right? Because these things are happening at important community sites, where folks, find not just a sense of community, but like that's where they adhere themselves to our communal norms, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I mean, when I think of the United States, when I think of the American revolutionaries during the colonial period and their protests, I mean, you have to sort of, if you're going to compartmentalize things, think about the intellectual aspect of the movement. What were their demands? What were they complaining about? And of course, that's clearly laid out in the Declaration of Independence. Their grievances against the king, if you want to refer to that. It's, when I talk about that in my classes to my students, when you read like the second 2/3 of it, to me, it just sounds like a jilted lover complaining about, like listing all of the things that went wrong in the relationship. The king has done this, the king has done that, and this is why we hate the king. And you didn't take me out on this particular day when you promised to, and yada. Like it's a long list of complaints. but it led to militarized protest, an all-out insurgency against what was at the time the most powerful, the superpower at the time, Great Britain.
Yeah.
And resulted in a whole new independent nation that, for some reason, since then, protesting against that very idea has been the norm.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really real.
Yeah, I just want to add to that point. I think, when you see sort of the framing of the founding of this country, which completely erases and actually distorts the actual violent nature of its founding, right, through the genocide of Native people and chattel slavery, you find a lot of rhetoric around live free or die, give me liberty or give me death. Rebellion becomes very common. And even how it's taught to our children, right, our youth, now in schools across the country. But we need to begin to reckon with the fact that the only time that that those slogans or any rhetorical devices or anything like that remotely parallels those things are just not acceptable when they come from Black people, right? But when it comes to violent conquest and murder of white European folks, those are acceptable, right? And just adding to the way that I see social change, most of my framing comes from Black feminist abolitionists, including Ruth Wilson Gilmore, Beth Ritchie, of course, Angela Davis, who aim to not only sort of shed light and really shed a light on the systems of punishment, control, and violence, including some of those things that we were just naming, but also see them as part of a larger culture of white supremacy and capitalism. And with that, of course, the abolition of not just prisons and jails, but also the systems, institutions, including ones of capitalism, homophobia, patriarchy, and racism.
Amazing. Yeah, I think there's a really good tie between what you're saying and what Chaz was saying, right? If we're going to say generally that political change is like a material redistribution of power and resources, then we're going to say what's keeping us from redistributing that, right?
Yeah.
And so we should say it with our chest, right? Like that political change means taking on anti-Blackness, means taking on capitalism, right? I think y'all are hitting all these nails on the head.
I think it's important.
I'm sorry, like to add to like this conversation of like what is political change, right? I want to suggest like that the United States is actively always practicing political change because it's always making and remaking itself, right? So in the moment of 2008, when the economy crashes, right, we make and remake the moment of political change by giving people fixed rate mortgages, but by large and far, Black people and brown people get the adjustable rate mortgages, right? That sends us further into debt and kicks us out of our homes, right? And even in this particular moment, as we are experiencing what one would consider like political change, right? If you pay attention to the public discourse that is happening, what people are actually pushing for is not necessarily change. And I'm talking about white allies that have now gotten a clue as to what's happening in America. They're not necessarily like pushing for change. They're pushing for comfort. If you're paying attention to some of these chants and paying attention to some of these boards that are being held up in some of these marches, right? It is what can we give to these people to shut them up, to get us back to where we were? And a lot of the posts are saying, okay, we want to go back to how things were. But the reality of the fact in terms of how things were, Black folk were put in the position of what Danielle Allen calls democratic sacrifice. In other words, Black folk having to go without is what makes the American engine possible, right? So if we're going to talk about a moment of political change and what that means for this moment right now, right? It does mean the radical redistribution of resources, wealth, and different things of that sort. But what it necessarily means, if we are going to be invested, right, in this project that we call America, right, what it means for me is that we shift the position of who carries the weight of democratic sacrifice, right? And the weight of democratic sacrifice is certainly inclusive of, right, police brutality, but it's just not exclusive to police brutality, right? We can talk about who gets access to jobs. We can talk about who gets access to institutions. We can talk about the way that the lives of trans folk and the lives of women, certainly Black women, are silenced over and over again by cis Black males. How y'all doing? Shout out to y'all. Right, like all of those things are important. So who holds the weight of democratic sacrifice in American society is radically, radically important. And I think what we are failing to understand is exactly what what one of the reports from the civil rights era had found, right? That the ghetto is deeply implicated, right, in suburban America. It is deeply implicated. And so, in other words, Crenshaw is deeply implicated in Westwood, right?
No, wait, hold on. Not everyone is from the LA area. Can you?
Oh, okay. So the Black areas of town, the Black areas of town are deeply implicated in the white areas of town, right? To the extent that we have like police officers just roving all over the place in Black communities is the same measure to which white communities are able to walk around free like this doesn't happen. The only reason why we have this moment that has blown out of control is because finally we have moved from taking this shit to being, oh Lord, sorry y'all, for those of you who have children watching. We have moved this now from our communities to breaking down Mark Jacobs in Beverly Hills. Do you understand what I'm saying? To going through West Hollywood, right? To breaching these particular barriers that are in Minneapolis and forcing white folk into this conversation and saying, we have been carrying the weight of democratic sacrifice. Now it is your turn to carry that weight. So when we talk about political change, to me, that is necessarily what that requires. We don't want your lip service. We sick of your letters. We sick of your statements. We're sick of all of that. How about now you now take on the position of Black and address what's been happening in the lives of Indigenous folk, Black folk, brown folk, trans folk, et cetera, so on and so forth.
Antwann, excuse me, could you repeat that line again? Black folks, the ghetto, are deeply implicated in the American democratic experiment. Like I can't put it the way you put it. Can you repeat that again?
So what's happening in the communities of Black, what I'm saying is what is happening in the communities of Black folk is deeply implicated in the communities of white folk. So in order for white folk, right, to have peace, for them to go shopping through to whatever, we necessarily have to be in a position of lack or inequality is what I'm saying, right? Because of the bifurcation of American society.
So I think this is a profoundly simplistically elegant statement, because as you were describing that, I thought of the US Constitution itself in its creation, right? The US Constitution, when it was created, came at the expense of Black people, right? The only way that the southern states, well, first of all, let me back up. First 12 years of the United States, we were under a previous system of government called the Articles of Confederation. It wasn't working out, so we met in the summer of 1787 in Philadelphia to decide, are we going to move forward with this, this new republic? And what came out of that was aspects of what we have now, but it wasn't finalized yet, the United States Constitution. The final sticking point was, it was decided the southern states need to get something that makes them sign on to this new constitution that grants to the central government more authority at the expense of the individual states. And what they wanted was something included in the Constitution that protects their interests as slaveholders, economically, politically. So the Constitution itself was drafted and finalized and ratified at the expense of Black people in the form of two pieces of legislation included in the Constitution: the 3/5 clause, which most people are familiar with, which counted Black people, which counted slaves, I should say, as if they were property-owning white men aged 21 years and older who could vote. They were counted towards representation in the House of Representatives. And then the other important piece of legislation was the Fugitive Slave Law of 1793, which it did two things. It granted to slave owners the right to retrieve their runaway slave property no matter where they escaped in the United States, even in northern non-slaveholding states. And the other thing that it did is it jeopardized the freedom. I'm not going to use the term of free Black people because there was no such thing as a free Black person at the time. I'll use the term instead non-enslaved Black people. It jeopardized the so-called freedom of non-enslaved Black people. So to return back to my point, which Antwann, you made me think of in your description, the Constitution itself was created at the expense of Black people. So the notion of American democracy, this new republic as enshrined in the Constitution could only have come about by including the 3/5 clause and the Fugitive Slave Law of 1793, which laid the groundwork for everything that we're seeing up to the 21st century. Your analogy about the ghetto is deeply implicated in suburban white America is the perfect analogy, the perfect microcosm of what happened. I think it was in 1789 when the Constitution was finally ratified. So thank you for that point, Antwann.
Yeah. First of all, you know way more than most law students. Let me just state that unequivocally. Sorry, professors.
Chaz, did you want to say something? Because I had something. But
No, I was going to actually throw back to you. I know you had something you want to touch back on.
Yes.
I just wanted to just sort of like add in where I think Cheryl Harris's work fits in here. And in terms of like, so I'll try and explain it in the most concise way possible for those of you who haven't read it. Cheryl Harris writes this piece called Whiteness as Property. It's one of the big time Cheryl Harris pieces where she sort of like writes through like our understanding of property is even racialized, right? And it's understood through a racial lens. W.E.B. Du Bois points this out when he writes Black Reconstruction. And he talks about at the time the Constitution was written, only a small part of Americans actually were protected under the Constitution because the Constitution was written for property owners. When the enslaved ran away from the plantation, the crime that they were committing was stealing. They were stealing themselves, right? And so this understanding, and forgive me, so if I'm like jumping ahead of where you're going to go, but this understanding even of a violation of property comes out of that tradition, right? We violate things that people own. We violate things, but this understanding is very new, right? This ownership, the type of ownership that we have now and the ways in which we violate that is really like post-Enlightenment thinkers.
And one thing that I would also add on, and I loved Antwann your point, and I love Steph your point, and I want to link this to what I'm hearing in a lot of the current conversations, right? And it's the conversation around, whether people are looting, right? And to me, that's the very thing that, Tamika Mallory, I think her viral point, right? Like I learned looting from you, right? And so exactly, I think Antwann's point, that democratic sacrifice, some folks are having literally a conversation saying, no, actually I'm taking what's mine, right? Yes. Like, and this is what's owed to me, right? And so, yeah, I just want to kind of link through also for people where, if I could take what Antwann's saying, yeah, folks on the ground are having a much different conversation around, this kind of sacrifice. I definitely know that my community has been looted, right? My potential has been looted. My future has been looted, right? Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, I love that.
Amazing. I think one thing that I'm seeing, Rod, did you have something?
I kind of don't want to skip around, but I do want to touch on that a little bit. But
this
you can
how
go ahead.
all of our friendships go.
So yeah, I think I'll bring it back to something Steph was talking about, which is like the idea of discourse, right? And the way that we're talking about these things, because historically that's not new. Talking about rioters and looters in the ways that we talk about them, that's not nothing new, because it's a way to basically separate them, scapegoat them from the larger movement. Again, historically, those have been used to create difference. And so in the contemporary era, that's sort of marked by colorblindness and sort of the violent enactment of the criminal justice system, those things just are more concrete right now, right? We're witnessing a part of the construction of what Robin Kelly refers to as the thug nation, right? And so we're witnessing, really what we're witnessing is the thuganization of the movement, right? Because it's effective right now. It's the easiest scapegoat, looters and rioters, and the way that, social movement scholars have classified those historically is also problematic and has contributed to this idea. And what that does is that it allows, differentiating looters and rioters from the larger movement allows the state, which include the police and the public, to see those people as as a threat and disposable, right? And so you get a case where the 22-year-old man in California was killed near a protest site, right? Because again, these are looters, these are criminals, right? They become criminalized by association to the movement. And again, let's not forget about the arbitrary nature of those words, because again, this country has been stealing, these corporations have been stealing wages from people since their start, right? Because for me, right, I think asset forfeiture from police department, I think that's looting. I think stealing people's property and money is looting. But again, we don't think of those things. And, combined around 40 billion in assets were taken from a lot of communities, right? From Black and brown communities through that program, through asset forfeiture, but we don't talk about that as looting.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And for folks who aren't familiar, asset forfeiture is something that happens a lot with arrests where you literally don't get your stuff back. And it could be because of the court process. It could be because they lost it. There's so many reasons, but it actually is a huge part of generating revenue, and it's put in the budget. And so it turns around, and since we police communities of color, particularly Black communities, it's taking their own resources from them and putting it back into the budget to police them. So that's a little bit of what Rod is talking about.
And one other, I was watching recently, Kimberly Crenshaw was actually talking about the Ferguson report, right? Yes. And so that also connection of every time the St. Louis kind of city needed resources, right? They would extract more from the Black communities, right? And so, yeah, I think exactly that point, right? Like, how do we also see this as, this kind of racial capitalism, right? This extractive industry. And for me, yeah, I'm already seeing like again, that question of looting, and how I think people are conceptually playing with that and attempting to flip it on its head, I think is like, let's get that sort of organic intellectualism, right? Happening.
I want to encourage folks who are watching.
I think, just to jump on that, Chaz, I think to bring us back to Sophie's original question, right? Like, if we think of that report as sort of like this point of allowing that kind of dialogue to be brought to the forefront, right? Like, that's something that doesn't just happen in Ferguson. That's something that happens everywhere. Right. I mean, there's so much documentation that this is happening in a lot of Black cities. We can think of Pilsen in Chicago, where they do the exact same thing in a large Latinx community, right? But that sort of report allows people to like have something to grab onto as sort of like this recent memory of something, bringing about like something that we can tag onto when we talk through these problems. And so just thinking about that report as like a point of political change, right? A point of like, oh yeah, there's this way that police are funding themselves by criminalizing us, right? Cities are funding themselves in order to like continue to criminalize us, in order for them to like make themselves, more real, make themselves look more legitimate. And when they can turn around and point to us, it's like, see, but we had to, because y'all get so many parking tickets, or see, we had to, because you got a speeding ticket last week and we got to stop all these speeders, right? And I think that is some of like when we can like sort of stretch out of this legislative ideas around, because that report didn't necessarily directly result in a lot of political change in terms of like legislative change. There were a couple of new laws sort of like changed in Ferguson, but if we're talking about some kind of national change, not much effect there. But people continue to bring that report up when they're having these dialogues about like how police, state agencies are sort of like, if we want to use the term looting these communities in order to fund themselves.
By the way, lest we forget, white supremacy is a global phenomenon.
Right.
Since the so-called European age of exploration of the globe and the colonization of the Americas and Africa and Southeast Asia and so on and so forth, and there is going on in the world right now, at the same time that these protests are unfolding in the United States, there's an international aspect to this conversation. There's an aspect to the discourse that wants to deal with the concept of looting on the global level, on, you know, in terms of Western civilization's relationship with its current colonies or former colonies, or, you know, a sort of neo-colonial relationship as well. That, for example, you know, much of Western Europe, let's pick France, for example, sustains itself on the natural resources of, you know, many of its so-called former colonies in Africa. I mean, we can have a conversation about looting on a global level as well. You know, I just wanted to throw that in there, you know, to make things a little more, you know, interesting.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
To sort of like bring all this together, I feel like folks watching might be like, oh no, they've mentioned literally all of history when talking about political change. I just want to encourage folks who are with us to just sit with that for a minute. As you can see, I gave them one question and they were able to just spew out all these really different points in history and different relationships and different political dynamics. And that's part of it. Political change has a very broad scope, because to take us back to the beginning, to shift power, you have to understand the whole history of how we set up our power relationship. So thank you all. That was a great first question. I'm going to push us along because we could talk for 5 hours and we've done it. So there's really no doubt in my mind that I need to keep us in some sort of science people.
I just want to say our name drop game has been fire. I just want to compliment everybody on that. It's been so fire.
Yeah, doing a reading for the first time.
Oh, and this person.
All right, Steph, wait till we drop your work. It'll be fine.
But I will come through the camera. I'm just going to turn my sound off and play Nuck If You Buck.
You know, honestly, that's your word. All right.
Big facts.
So our next question that I want us to focus on is, what are the other revolutions or maybe nonviolent actions throughout history that we can look to besides the civil rights movement, Stonewall, and Rodney King? And these are obviously, you know, huge focal points in our history. But I want us to encourage a robust understanding of the historical formation that we just sort of haphazardly summarized in question 1.
So since oh, sorry, someone wants to go ahead.
No, go, Dr. Wright.
Okay, sorry. So since with the last question, I attempted to raise things, I guess, to the global international level. You know, let's throw the Haitian Revolution into the mix, right?
Yes, please. What was that?
It seems to me whenever we're discussing things that we owe in world history, our modern day freedom to, we owe it to the sacrifice, the heroism of the American revolutionary, right? The genius, you know, the bravery of the French revolutionaries, but not the Haitian revolutionaries. You know, Black people with knives and guns are not heroic, are not revolutionaries, are not freedom fighters, are not demanders of liberty in the same way that white people with knives and guns are during the French Revolution, during the American Revolution, in the same way that Black people during the period of Nat Turner's revolt or other slave revolts in the United States were not revolutionaries, right? So that obviously there's, you know, in conceptualizing revolution, you know, revolution of the sort that brings about freedom, liberty, justice, pushes humanity forward, it's riven with racist ideology, utterly riven with racist ideology. So I just wanted to make that point there.
Absolutely. Antwann.
So a period that so in thinking about what are other nonviolent moments that we can look to, I really think that we need to think about the nonviolent rebellions that took place once King was assassinated, right? And this is going to challenge some people's framework, right? And I'll lay this out from the outset. When Black folk are burning down buildings, when we are forcing the reallocation of resources, that is nonviolent. Please understand that, right? In most areas that we come from, what the retribution is that if you take one of ours, we're taking two of yours, right? And so we need to be in a space of being thankful, right? that Black folk have not laid waste to this construction, this political construction and project that we call the United States of America, right? So why am I saying that we should look to the rebellions that took place post King's assassination, right? Or truly his murder, if we want to be honest with that. What we saw is exactly what we're seeing now. We saw every city in the United States go up, right? In flames, right? And to me, that is a non-violent moment to look to. Why? Because Black folk were not out killing white folk because you had just taken the most peaceful among us, right? In this sense, Breonna Taylor was not bothering anyone. Do you understand what I'm saying? George Floyd was not bothering anyone. Ahmaud Arbery, not bothering anyone. Tony McCabe was not bothering anyone, right? And what the expectation has been, and what has been the request from media, from white allies, from white America is, could you please be peaceful as we kill your Black ass in the street? And the reality of the fact is that that is irrational. Which one among us is going to sit here and keep our mouths quiet, right, as we are being killed? That's irrational. So moments that we can look to understand how do we navigate this moment is the exact moment when Dr. King is murdered and the cities go up in flames. And for once, and it's been said many times over social media, but I will say it again, we need to be thankful that Black folk are burning down buildings and not taking out people. We have to understand how much psychological strength that takes, right? For someone's family to actually watch their loved one on social media over and over and over and over again be murdered, and no one in that family has shown up to snuff out that entire police force, right? So why am I pointing, I'll shut up after this. So why am I pointing back to the rebellions, not the riots? Because riots is what white boys do when their hockey teams lose, right? Why am I looking like to this moment of Dr. King, well, post Dr. King's assassination to understand this moment? Because that is the moment when Black folks understood once yet again that we can tie all of our stuff together, we can make a demand, and we can make it happen, and we can force the state to concede. We can force them to concede, right? And now we might have to take it like in steps, unfortunately, right? But Eric Garcetti, for those of you who might be watching other places, Eric Garcetti certainly came off of that $150 million that Black Lives Matter LA placed a demand for, right? And we're gonna keep on placing demands on that ass, right? And the reality of the fact is that if you want peace in white America, you're gonna have to run us what's due us, right? And so that's what these moments post the King assassination showed us, that when we get to it, when Target comes down, the needs of Black America gets addressed, right? I'm gonna stop right there before I go too far, and I've been talking too much. So there's that. I hope that made sense.
I love it. I love it.
We got it.
Again, right? We're thinking Fannie Lou Hamer, right? You know, if I don't have it, you're not gonna have it, and we're gonna tear it up, right? I mean, just reiterating those frames again and again and again. They aren't new, right? We have this very rich tradition, and there's a lot there to actually dig into and dig out of. So.
And the whole point, like for me, Chaz, is like that I want to drive home for people that are watching this, is that please understand that when you see buildings burning, that is peaceful. Please understand that it's peaceful. I cannot drive that point home like strong enough, right? I love the shirt that I'm wearing in terms of Florence and Normandy. When we think back to 92, maybe that should have been the moment that I went to, right? Because what happened in this moment was that all the white folks took off and went to Beverly Hills, and law enforcement formed a barrier keeping Black folk right from breaching Beverly Hills. But our organizing efforts and what we've been able to do since that time has allowed us to breach the barrier of Beverly Hills and other affluent areas in America to say, you know what, if this is what's going to happen in our communities, that Marc Jacobs store is coming down. Gucci over in Atlanta is coming down. You have to rerun us that. And I think what people have to understand, the reason why I'm painting those moments as nonviolence is because we have to understand, y'all, it's the top of the month. Rent is due. We're in the moment of COVID-19. Ain't nobody had checks for about a good 2 to 3 months. So you're sitting up over here in these wealthy, affluent areas with checks, right, on top of checks that you are making off of the lives of working class folks, right? And you are sustained through these moments, but we are suffering. Our children are not eating. We do not have the resources to pull on, and you want us to be quote unquote peaceful. What's peaceful is the fact that I am breaking into your store and not breaking into your house, right? And getting those goods and selling them on offer up so that my child can eat, right? Selling them on Poshmark so that my rent can be paid. Because the little $1,200 that the government called themselves running us as they ran Jeff Bezos and everybody else, their little tax break that looted the government, right, is not doing me any good, right? And I need more than $1,200. So please understand that when we run up in Gucci, when we run up in Alexander McQueen, when we run up in Christian Louis Vuitton, that is peaceful because we are reappropriating the resources, and that's gonna be bad on that. That's how I'm sorry. That's how I feel about that. I'm gonna shut up. Sorry.
Drink your tea. Drink your tea.
To follow that at all, but I just wanted to maybe
does something to me. I'm sorry.
No, you are fine. I just was like, well, I guess it's in there.
Next question. No.
I guess I'll see y'all later. No, I just wanted to nail this point to the wall just a little bit, because I don't know what the word is, but like I'm gonna go with disturbed, which feels mild because like the feeling is much bigger than that. I'm disturbed by all these people who have this like understanding of these like innocent corporations that are being attacked. I mean, I don't even know where to start. We can go with just the Marxian analysis of how much they're paying their employees. We can look at this in a neoliberal context of like where they're even getting some of these goods from and the kind of oppression and like, I mean, if we're gonna call that looting, I mean, that's another form of looting that we can pin to. And I think when we start to talk about this moment in particular, I mean, and just thinking about like, you know, this interaction between corporations and a community, I always lean on Detroit, and particularly I lean on DRUM and the League of Revolutionary Black Workers, because, you know, there's sort of analysis that they put forward. If you haven't seen it, for those of you who are watching, there's this really great documentary that was produced by the League. I think it came out in 68, but it might have been 69, called Finally Got the News. And they go through, like, this is this corporation. For them, they were particularly talking about Ford.
Can you say that a little bit louder?
Which part?
The last piece about the film?
It's Finally Got the News. I think it was produced in 68, but it might have been 69. So don't.
We forgive you.
Yeah, forgive me. I don't remember those years, you know. But no, I mean, so their analysis, they lean heavily on a Marxist-Leninist analysis. I mean, they didn't have the term racial capitalism that we use today, but they talk about how these analyses aren't really built into what the Black experiences are, right? For those of you who don't know, back then Ford Motor Companies would pay Black workers less than they would pay white workers, but they also organized the city in a way that segregated Black communities. So they literally built a community for workers that were coming up from the South in order to live and work at Ford Motor Companies. And the type of like sustainment that those neighborhoods had was, I mean, bad at best and atrocious at worst. And then when they would have race riots in Detroit, the police would be there. People who were part of the government would be there. And you would literally have this easy to pick off community because they were only allowed to live in one place. Then Ford Motor Company cuts, right? Bounces out of Detroit after World War II. And what's left but a whole community of people that aren't even allowed to like have accessible jobs anymore, right? All of the things that were funding Detroit goes away. And so we see some of the like detriment that's still playing out in Detroit today. And we're talking about something that happened 40, 50 years ago. And if these things are still playing out, and we think of these corporations as like sort of helping our communities, right? They're providing these jobs, they're providing avenues for working class communities to stay working class, which is really all that they're doing for us. And when we talk about like, oh, people hit Target or people hit Gucci, it's just, it's wild to me because I'm like, okay, like because Target is a big contributor to like racial injustice. Like I don't know what to say.
Why?
So can we say, you know, corporations are the organizational manifestation of systematized, institutionalized, routine looting?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah.
Quotidian looting.
Quotidian looting. That's the hashtag for this meeting, y'all.
Indian looting.
Why?
Oh my goodness.
Roger, you gonna say something? I'm sorry if our Kiki cut you off.
No, I just kind of want to add to both of the points, which is that like white capitalist America does not know what peace is.
Right.
They've distorted that word. It's been used for ages, centuries as a tool of colonization, to mark us as uncivilized, unpeaceful, as not innocent. When they have such atrocious ideals, right? And so we shouldn't play that game of letting them dictate sort of what the groundwork is for peaceful protest or otherwise. And then I also just want to mention that like our folks inside of prisons and jails have been doing a lot of this work since the inception of prisons and jails, with George Jackson and the BGA, the Black Guerrilla Army, sort of leading the way for other movements, including the 2018 prison demonstrations where workers fought for conditions, for them to be compensated for their wages, and for ongoing violence that we often don't see or hear of because they're incarcerated. And so again, I think, you know, particularly the Attica prison rebellion, I think presents us with an example of riots working, if we want to go by the positivistic sort of whatever framing of movements, right? Because ultimately prisoners there, dozens were murdered, guards were killed during the actual riot, but prison conditions were negotiated, change happened. Not only that, but it left a historical legacy to where folks both inside of other prisons and outside of prisons have sort of used the same tactical sort of the same types of demonstrations or sort of actions, right? Direct actions, particularly through rioting and looting. And with that also, this idea that if we're taking prisons, sort of, if I'm talking through the logic of prison rebellion, the same thing in a society where our neighborhoods, where our cities are increasingly, especially Black communities, are starting to look, Black neighborhoods particularly resemble prisons more and more with surveillance and incarceration, then we can sort of frame these in this way too, right? In that we're essentially becoming more and more, the carceral state is expanding more so every day, right? And so yes, people, that's fucked up. Like, yes, people are gonna riot, right?
Rod, you're gonna have to talk through the carceral state because, like, I'm sure people watching
Don't know what that is.
don't know what that is.
Right, we're still, they're still processing peace as a thing that they don't get to the back. I don't mean to drag the audience. I'm so sorry, y'all.
Wow. So carceral, that's a big term. There's a lot in that. I think a lot of it begins with with the white supremacist and capitalist culture of punishment. particularly of control, surveillance, and violence as a way to address social issues, social problems, what we call social problems, particularly through economic means. It's an ideology, it's a structure that creates institutions, that's embedded within institutions. It does include the prison industrial complex, which is a network of private and public institutions, including schools and prisons, of course, that again seek to control, surveil, and violate Black folks, communities of color mainly. I don't know, is that good enough for you, Steph?
Y'all brought your teacups for a reason.
Back in this. And I want to say, like, to tie this in, like, with what Rod is mentioning about the carceral state and how Black communities become carceralized, right? So, in other words, this process of carcerality takes place beyond prisons. I want to suggest to everyone watching that the U.S. understands the language of abolition, right? And the reason why I state that is because Black communities are very much carceralized, right? In other words, there is heightened surveillance, right? There is the superimposition of policing, right? We see drones in our communities, etc. When does all of that stuff disappear? When our communities begin to become gentrified through whatever means, right? Most recently brought on by the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act that was introduced by the Orange and Chief, right? So when in that particular act introduced what is called opportunity zones, right? Which allow businesses to get investments in Black communities, right? And get a return on their money if they invest in our communities, which brought on gentrification. And what does gentrification bring on? It brings on a radical change in demographics. Therefore, right, abolishing the carceral practices that are in our communities, right? So what I want to understand, what I just want to put out there in terms of, because another thing that I see is that people are talking about abolish the police, abolish prisons, that's too far, etc. But what I'm bringing that up for is for the express purposes of putting out there that we in the United States already understands what abolition means, right? Even if we want to look at Paul Manafort and his crooked ass, right? We understood what abolition meant because Trump ran up in that prison quicker than quick can get ready and got him out under the auspices of COVID-19, right? So we understand abolition when we want to, and I think that is also important to tie to this question of what you are asking us in terms of what movements can we look to. White people ain't dumb. White people been understanding abolition. You want to know why? Because when they are under financial duress, what do? They go in that bank and they get that loan. White people understand exactly what abolition is because they demand it and they get it every single time they ask for it, period, when it comes down to it, right? And who understands abolition the best are white women. And why do I say that? It's because when it goes down, what do? They cry their liberation tears, abolition on the spot, right? To get exactly what it is they need. So I just want to put that out there, and we're going to be okay. I'm not sure if I got people clenched up, but you're going to be all right.
Everybody's like,
I learned a lot in one go, right? We've had years of reading this scholarship to and lots of life experience.
I also want to point to this period that Robin Kelly, this name drop game, Robin Kelly, I think he points to this all the time, right? This period between 64, maybe 68 and 72, where 300 cities were on fire.
Can you speak up a little bit, Bae?
I'm talking hella loud. Let me turn my volume up. Can you hear me better?
I can hear you.
We can hear you.
Okay. I mean, I'm talking hella loud. Ask the neighbors. They hearing this too.
I bet the neighbors know my.
All right.
I don't even know what point I was making anymore. Shit. What was I saying? Yes, 300 cities, right? So all these cities go up in flame. And this is where, when I was thinking about this question, I kept leaning on, we have this tendency when we historicize, right? Meaning when we record history, or when we decide what story to tell, when we decide the kinds of story to tell, or the people who are allowed to tell their stories, right? We lean on places, names, one single person, right? When I talk to my students about the civil rights movement, they're like, yeah, Martin Luther King was a great guy. And that's what they know, right? We lean on, names of wars, and that is how our history is told. It's through these like benchmarks, right? And so when you talk about Stonewall, when you talk about the civil rights movement, when you talk about 92, right? What you miss is all of these things that will never have a name. All of these, revolutions and revolts and rebellions that will never have a name. When we think of all of the Native revolutions that have just been untold, I mean, I'm not even saying that they are ignored. You would have to be, you would have to have some kind of meter to even describe them, to even think about that, right? But we don't have that. When we talk about the history of rebellions and the history of revolutions, it's such a small slice of a much bigger pie of people trying to fight against the system, as they call it. The state may be in their name. Racial capitalism is the word that I use, right? And trying to stick in this struggle of trying to fight for, I mean, as we're putting it, this project of America, project of democracy, and not in the name of America or democracy, but rather in this vision of what this place could be, right? This vision of how we can still overturn this, right? And this is something that I see as something that I get from this sort of like conversation from sort of like the rebellious, I don't know what you want to call them, the people who are setting the fires, right? Those people. They still have this idea, which is what Antwann was pointing to, of like, well, if we burn it down, we can rebuild it, right? It's not burning it for the sake of burning it. It's burning it so we can replace it with something else. And that cry for me, it's really inspiring, because I mean, for all this shit to go down and for you to still have an idea that like we still got hope, we can still do something better. Let's just get rid of this building, this corporation, and we can come back, y'all. Like, it's not too late. And that is incredible. I mean, I think that is a powerful message. I think the pushback to that always comes from, is it too soon, right? Is it too soon to burn things down? Like, have we made it there yet to where we have no other options? And this is where I lean on the fact that, I mean, the dichotomy between nonviolence and violence, as Antwann and Chaz and Raj have already pointed out, like that line even is just a bad line. It's a bad line, and it's nefarious, and it's only really drawn by people who are allowed to have power and hold discourse. But all of these are tactics, right? So you want to talk about boycotts, you want to talk about sit-ins, you want to talk about die-ins, you want to talk about marches, you want to talk about speeches, you want to talk about looting, you want to talk about burning stuff. They're all tactics, right? They're all available tactics. And whether or not we should deploy them, I think people sometimes want to privilege certain ideas around what works. But the reality is like who thought Stonewall was gonna work? Like, I mean, no one was sitting there at the bar like, you know what we gotta do, guys? And then we'll have a parade. That's not how it went. That's not how the story is told, should be told at all. Like we don't know what's gonna be the thing. You know, if you'd asked me a month ago, are we gonna have nationwide rebellions in every city? Because somebody, because of a Black death, I'd have been like, I mean,
during a pandemic?
Happen. I guess it can always happen, but I'm sorry, Devon, you were gonna say something?
No, I was adding, during a pandemic, mind you.
Pandemic, yes. Like, I would have been like, I mean, what's, you know, like one more tragedy. I know to folks around me, you know, I feel every one. One of the things that really got me, and I hope I don't get emotional talking about this, but one of the things that really got me in organizing, you know, around this recent sort of like set is like, I mean, I just kept like, I am tired of testing for this. I'm tired. I'm tired of talking about this. I'm tired of thinking about this. I'm tired of having to see people debate whether or not like police brutality exists. I'm tired of seeing people debate where the line is of justifiable murder of Black people. I'm tired of seeing people having to stop what they're doing and go out in the fucking street and scream at the people who are harming them. Like, I'm tired. And I feel that energy this time, right? I feel the energy of just being like, again, we doing this again? We have to do this again? We have to say the same thing to you again? And I mean, children, adults, women, men, trans folks, gender non-binary folks, like, we're throwing all of this at you, right? These unrecognizable bodies, we're throwing them at you and being like, here's a list of people that this has happened to, here's a list of names, here's a list of cities, here's a list of dates, and none of that has changed anything. So we gotta march again. Sorry. My bad.
I would say, like, the one thing, like, Steph, that you're bringing up for me, and I think is important for people to understand, is the radical capacity of burning it down, and the potential that creates for Black people and what Black people see. I think that's one point. The second thing that you were pointing to in terms of these things being tactics is very, very important, because if people go to each city in each building that's been hit, there's a story behind it. Right? There's always something that happened at that Target, at that pharmacy, at that gas station, right? There's a story behind it, right? And what I want people to understand is that when we do deploy those tactics, it is done strategically. We are not just hitting places just to be hitting places. We got sense. We know what we're doing, right? So when that Target lit up, and then it later came out that Target had deeply participated in policing in the area, for the whole, they're like, oh, I get it now. We move with common sense. When we occupy highways, that is strategic. Those are the same highways that via the Federal Highway Act of 1956 was built to break up Black communities and to segregate Black communities socially, economically. So we stand on the 408 in Central Florida. We stand on the 405 in California, and in a 10 here in Los Angeles as well, as a way to remind you that we are cognizant of what has happened historically, and that these walls and these structures of segregation and exclusion that you have erected is still doing its work, and we are still being harmed by that generations later. So I just wanted to, like, emphasize and highlight and underscore, like, this point that Stephanie is bringing out, that these are tactics, they are rational tactics, and they make sense. If you think you are being inconvenienced on the highway and can't get where you're going, think about what that same structural barrier has done to Black communities for decades now. And what's interesting to me is that the Highway Act in 1956 gets passed 2 years after Brown versus Board, right? So when you get a constitutional decree that even came with a caveat of with all deliberate speed, which allowed you to take your sweet precious time, right? When you get that decree from the Supreme Court, what you do is you roll out a Highway Act that says, all right, we can't segregate them through education, we'll segregate them through highways. That's why we stand on the highways, right? That is why we burn down these sources, because there's a narrative behind this joint. Ain't nobody crazy. That's what, I'm gonna stop right there because I don't want to expose what's going on in LA and why we did what we did in '92. But there's a reason why Los Angeles caught fire, and there's a reason why those specific buildings caught fire. Catch the narrative behind it, right? Because word to the wind, there are Asian folk who are hella anti-Black and don't care to see our ass here. But we'll stop. Thank you, Stephanie, for bringing those wonderful, beautiful points out.
I think you froze for a second. It was like the Zoom call like censored you for a split.
Oh,
No. We got the message, and then
Yeah.
I'm sure just the last tail end. I think that's really
I'll calm down.
to highlight like the theme of what y'all are saying here. Like, I guarantee that folks at home, and even me, because y'all always continue to teach me, don't know every single piece of history that y'all just mentioned, and you guys are naming it on the fly, right? And you know the full story. And so part of what we're addressing today is just how much history folks don't know, and specifically the history of social movements. There is a difference between knowing when the civil rights movement happened and what were the 4 major organizations. If you can't name them, you really got to reevaluate how much of social movement history you know. And I
You proposed that I have a dream speech and haven't even heard the whole thing. Like,
oh,
I don't know what the whole thing was. I mean, I don't even know what the March on Washington was about. I'm sorry to drag the audience, but
no. I mean, that's so important. It's actually, part of the segue that I want to make in a moment. But Steph, I know that your work also specifically. I know it's time. It's about that time.
Do it.
So
Do it.
Steph is working on a great paper, and she also talks about the difference between what happens when you take a sort of local lens and what's happening in a specific community and follow that case versus this effort that is often necessary to make a national movement, and sort of the trade-offs and the strategies that make the strategies that communities choose. And so first of all, keep an eye out for that. Second, I think that really speaks to Antwann's point about y'all don't know what these communities are doing or why. And so for so many folks, it's hard to get that information in the first place, right? I know very few folks from Minneapolis, and so I'm being very careful about the information I share about that city, because I'm not enmeshed in that city's strategy or that even the conversation, right? I don't know their specific dynamics, and there's something rich about knowing your local history, right? Knowing what the freeways you drive on mean, right? I live right next to a freeway. Like it's very impactful in my physical life. And so I think the big question that a lot of folks are waiting for and have been waiting for this talk is, who decides who a riot is? And so we've done a lot of the work of bringing them up to speed on flagging historical points they don't know. But once they learn that history, once they start to engage with that history, what should they keep in their mind for answering the question, what is a quote unquote riot? What is quote unquote violence? And who decides? We've talked about this a little bit, but I really want to emphasize it. That was a long question, sorry.
question for Chaz. I'm just putting that out there.
That is a question for Chaz.
Why? Every time. Every time.
Come on, political science.
Well, I mean, right? Because, and actually, I was going to throw it back to Steph's line, right? Like, so the line is only actually drawn when you have that power to actually draw the line in the first place. And so for me, even engaging in the language and understanding, we're having a discursive kind of conversation when we're talking about riots, rebellions, insurrections, uprisings, right? Like, to me, yeah, it's one part of my brain saying, yes, it's very important what they call you, right? And that has an incredible amount of power. But I'm also, in the same vein, having the conversation, but like, all of that naming, that categorizing, right? It's still a part of this difference making. I think something that Antwann pointed to earlier, right? Like the state being involved in this remaking and unmaking and remaking again and again and again. And so how does that language always trap us, right? And kind of like trip us up, in any sort of way. So for me, it's a hard, kind of to actually say, oh, is this or this? For me, I also, when I hear riot, and again, thinking to Antwann's point, I think directionless, pointless, just this like, scurrying around to do something. But again, like Antwann's gesturing and letting us point us to, no, there's a rich history and a narrative. And I think what we're all invested in is bringing this knowledge of the masses, right? Like to the forefront. Like, no, we have our own epistemology, right? We have our own ways of knowing in knowing our own communities, and we know it, right? Whether it's valued or brought out. So for me, when I was asking this, right, I'm like, it's hard. You know, I think Sophia, I even talked to you about, you know, some of my family having conversation like, well, what's a good strategy? What's a bad strategy? You know, I think all these things really kind of get us into this complicated arena without thinking about, okay, cool, what are the positives, right? That this movement, this moment has really brought out the contradictions, right? Contradictions that we already knew were there, but like, what can we value around exposing those contradictions? How is it immediately creating new conditions? You know, I think everyone's really kind of point to, we don't get even the democratic, whatever, I guess, few democratic pieces that we have in this country without popular mobilizing in social movements, right? So I don't know what we call it. I don't know who gets to name it, right? I think that's really a question of power, but I think definitely holding on to what are the positives that we get out of this, exposing those contradictions, really talking about the conditions then for us to have new conversations and new discourse.
Can I speak to the concept of riots by putting it in the mouth of former Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, who oversaw, after 9/11, one of our military responses to the attacks on the World Trade Center towers and so on and so forth by the invasion of Iraq, when looting and rioting, general chaos started to ensue after the United States toppled the Saddam Hussein regime. This is what Donald Rumsfeld said about those riots. So Rumsfeld said, according to the Pentagon correspondent, while no one condones looting, on the other hand, one can understand the pent-up feelings that may result from decades of repression and people who have had members of their family killed by that regime, for them to be taking their feelings out on that regime. And I don't think there's anyone in any of those pictures who wouldn't accept it as part of the price of getting from a repressed regime to freedom. Those are Donald Rumsfeld's words on rioting in Baghdad after the United States invaded and toppled the regime.
Would y'all like to drink some tea?
That we supported, by the way, leading up to that invasion.
Tea.
Well, y'all all really brought your mugs. I think those words are perfect. I think, you know, that really forces a shift in our perspective, right? We don't really think of the department, like any sort of official who has authority to talk about military issues as, you know, thinking about uprisings in that way.
So partially to get Rod back for helping you put me on Front Street, I want to call on, you know, his dissertation work, which is like looking at Black fathers, in particular Black and Latinx men, as being always political bodies, right? And how their political bodies are always interacting with like state entities, always interacting with state institutions, and those formations being entangled with one another, right? And Rod particularly talks about this through fatherhood. But I also link this idea, I know Rod uses the term carceral state, but thinking about how Dylan Rodriguez talks about the prison regime, right? That's something that we're under, is this sort of prison regime where we're getting this line of where the state ends, constantly pushed outward, right? Constantly having to like readapt and rechange to these different notions of how we sort of like have to interact with the state, right? And the refusal process in that is always political, right? The refusal to interact with the state, the refusal to be monitored and surveilled is always political. Even when we're thinking about like, for example, students, you know, skipping school, right? We sometimes think of that as like, oh, that's just this thing that happens and we have to stop it. But also thinking of that as a political act, right? A political refusal to engage in an institution that may or may not be serving the community or these students in particular, right? And so in that engagement, right, when we talk about looting or riots, we cannot define riots without thinking about political rejection and refusal, right? We cannot define riots without interacting with and coming up against racial capitalism, neoliberalism, the prison regime, all these big terms that really just talk about how, you know, where the prison is coming to get you. Like, it's coming in your house. It's gonna be right here if we don't stop it. I think that in the past, I've been able to sit with better the fact that people have been maybe against looting or rioting. But now it feels, I'm gonna say this word even though it's, again, not the emotion, because it feels bigger. It feels weird because we're clearly watching like this fascist regime take over. And it's like, it's here, it's obvious, like all of these fascist signals are like blaring up. And how do you stop fascism? I mean, how would you propose? What is the alternative? I mean, the idea, if when we even talk about fascism, is like, it's this authoritative sort of like project, and it's totalitarian. So, I mean, do you ask it nicely? Like, is that the plan? do you go, please don't be a fascist country?
Look to the United States. Look to the United States as an example. You know, what did we do during World War II? You know, what did we do to deal with fascism in the World War II era?
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I also want to bring to our attention just the way that the media has continued to frame a lot of this, right? And support or non-support of riots. I saw a few things where a majority of people believe that, you know, the uprisings are justified. Another one found that a lot of people in Minneapolis, most people in Minneapolis, based on the poll, support the burning of the police precinct. A lot of people are fucking mad. Like, we should just know that much, right? But also, a lot of people do understand, right, what's going on, and so it's not all folks. And then related to that is the framing or the use of small businesses as a way of distracting, right? I guess first I want to say that a lot of small businesses, immigrant owned or non, are anti-Black as well, and so again, like Antwann was saying, there's a story there, right? There's a story with that. A lot of immigrant businesses are anti-Black, and there's a story and there's a message. And again, a lot of times those things are also overstated, particularly the claims that small businesses are the ones being burned down. That's not true, A. And B, a lot of y'all never supported any of these businesses. You never went to them in the first place.
I don't know, Steph's Shoe Collection.
Yeah, again, like I said in another post, like, I really welcome you to post receipts for the small businesses you supported every day of your life, as opposed to going to a Walmart or whatever. It's not true. It's not true.
You know, and I will say, because this happened in Atlanta, y'all know, like, Atlanta is home for me. Born in Orlando, but Atlanta is home for me. And one of the things that became a conversation, and speaking of small businesses, was the fact that some Black small businesses got hit, right? And what I need us to understand as people, I'm talking to the Black folk that are watching this, is that number one, all your skin folk ain't your kin folk. That's number one, right? Number two is that there has to be a class analysis placed on this. That just because you are a Black-owned business, it does not make you exempt, because some of us get the cash flow, we get the business established, we get everything, and you forget the struggle that got you to where you are, and you become alienated from the Black community. And then when we fall into a moment of distress, you all of a sudden become bewildered, right? And you become distressed, as Santana would say, and you wonder why your business has burnt to the ground. Because you have given that one little $500 scholarship that ain't paying for a least bit of textbook nowadays, right? And you have become completely divested from the Black community. If you have a Black business in Buckhead, Atlanta, I'm sorry, like, you got to understand the difference between Buckhead and Bankhead. For those of you that are watching that, like, there's a strong difference there, right? If you have a business in Buckhead, that suggests that you have revenue to pay that particular lease for that rental space, right? So, you know, as we are talking about what is going on intercommunally, I also am one of these people that is definitely, particularly as someone who is openly homosexual, right? You know, I definitely want to be critical of what's happening intra-communally, right? Because we can talk about how Breonna Taylor's and what her experience is, right? Is not, you know, getting like the traffic that we need to get in Tony McCain and others, right? We can also talk about the experience of our trans sister, right? Who cis Black men literally beat into the ground as we are marching on behalf of cis Black men. Yeah. We got to get our joint together as well, right? Now, that doesn't take away from the conversation like that we are having about, like, you know, burning these things down and different things of that sort. But I do want to put out there, right, that it is a crying damn shame that we got our gay asses out here in these streets, our trans asses out here in these streets, our gender non-conforming Black asses out here in these streets, and we are still dealing with BS from heterosexual cisgender Black men as we are fighting on your behalf. And as we are sitting here on this particular conversation or topic or stream, whatever you want to call it, in defense of rebellions, well, the name of the talk is in defense of riots, that is coming to your defense, but you are still like trampling us down. I don't know how I went that way, but I'm here anyway. But I just wanted to put that out there, and then to put like a nice bow on it. I want to be clear that that's not a conversation for white Americans to have about Black Americans. That is a conversation for Black folk to talk among Black folk about. We got it. Y'all worry about y'all uncle who won't stop shooting people and killing people and think he's the cop. Y'all worry about that uncle. We got this inside the community over here.
Antwann, when your show comes out, I'm going to be the first subscriber, okay?
Right here. I think we got there talking about like how there needs to be like a class analysis. There needs to be an analysis of like all the threads of power that run through a community. And that becomes even more complicated again when folks, you know, are struggling or maybe don't want to have full information about what's going on in cities, right? And that, you know, basically like our opinions don't matter, right? Like it's not for us.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. All right.
Yeah, I just want to emphasize that point for the non-Black Latinx community, not for us.
Look at us go.
Sophie, you know, I know we're not supposed to ask questions to the moderator, but I do have like a question for you as a law student.
Don't do
like,
this. I feel betrayed. I chose moderator for a reason.
I didn't expect this.
So why didn't you expect this?
What is this
about? I'm here to provide a platform for y'all. Okay, this is not turning into a roast session. What is your question?
My question is, you know, I have my thoughts on it, but can you speak to how law operates as an authoritative body, informing us of what violence is and what violence is not, as well as how law as a biased authority informs our morality and ethics in the United States as is based on an uneven foundation itself. Can you just give the people some context for how law is not neutral at all, that is biased in and of itself?
You just asked me to write my dissertation. So you got to give me 7 years to answer that question fully. But I think it's really multifaceted, right? Because we say law and we think like the thing that our Congress people pass. But I have been in very different nooks of what we even think law is, right? If y'all want to file an employment discrimination case, the winding road you have to take is very different than if you want to sue a cop. And both of those assume you want to sue somebody, which is in the court, right? There are so many buildings. For all the sociology folks in the house, just think iron cage again and again. So first of all, the law is a mess, and that's just what it is. We've talked previously about how the Constitution is a sham. Sorry, y'all. And you know, it was really designed to protect whiteness as property, right? So we're not starting from the same premise that a lot of folks are watching. But once you read Cheryl Harris and you come back to this video and you read it's really important to consider that law like uses neutrality as a sword and a shield.
Yes.
And what I mean by that is when we see folks say, hey, your setup hurts me, hurts my community, and is built so I cannot fix it. It says, well, I made neutral decisions, and adhering to precedent means I'm being consistent, and that's the fairest thing possible. But when the baseline isn't fair, what are you supposed to do? Right? You don't have an option. There is no neutral option sometimes, right? And we do see, you know, I think in so many movements, folks whose specific role in larger webs of effort is the legal route, right? So much of the civil rights movement focused on law, but again, that's not the only thing it did. But it was a deliberate and strategic move, right, to recodify our race relations and to shift them in some respect. And so what we considered to be a new baseline changes, right, with how we make that initial political change. So a lot of people think that like we have like our cultural problems, right? Like I have my internalized racism and then there's law and that's also racist. Like, no, you don't get that dichotomy. Like you are part of the problem, right? I invite y'all to read Brown v. Board and read Plessy. Shout out to Professor Crenshaw for actually training me a little bit in this. But look at them and you'll see that this isn't the liberating document you think it is. They're important like moments, or I'm sorry, not Plessy. With Plessy, you'll see that like, you know, we regard this as this terrible moment where, you know, slavery is, you know, just entrenched in Americans' legal history. But read it and see how much of that rhetoric you hear today. How old is that case? How relevant is that case? Y'all think slavery ended so many years ago? Like, no. The way we have been taught to engage with law goes all the way back to the day we decided to start using this set of laws and this set of legal formulas, right? And so I encourage y'all to see law as one site of change, but it's not neutral because it's constructed by folks in power for the purpose of protecting that power dynamic. And I know that might be hard to stomach, but the more laws you know and the more you work in the legal field, the more you see it. So now that I have my tirade, let's go. Let me transition back to y'all because I did not need that attention.
That was awesome. That was awesome though.
Yeah, thank you.
I hope I made my professors proud, because if not, then it's too late. All right. So this is the hard question, right? We've talked about, you know, how to understand this moment within a historical context, within the various frameworks we have at our disposal as scholars and as folks who have lived experiences in the US. But where do y'all fall? Like what's happening now? Is this movement? Is this riot? Is this protest? Like, given what we know about these histories, what's going on?
Black people in your shit, that's what's going on.
Y'all came out at the same time.
Go ahead, Dr. Wright.
Dr. Wright.
No, I'd say it's all of the above. As in just about any moment of, you know, social movement, protest movement, moment in the United States, it's all of the above. You know, different interests are going to categorize what's going on in different ways. You know, to some people it's a riot, you know, to some people it's, you know, the potential collapse of civilization, you know, to some people it's, you know, Black people are whining undeservedly about things that, you know, they need to just shut up about, you know. You got your rights during the civil rights era. What are you complaining about now? You know, I've seen discourses online, old, you know, traditional racist arguments. You know, Black people, really, what are you complaining about? You know, you and your ancestors were rescued from your barbaric, savage, pagan land in Africa. You had no history of your own. You had no civilization. What is there to complain about living in the greatest democracy on earth ever. So really, what is there to complain about, you ungrateful Negroes? I've seen this kind of discourse online. So it's all of the above. And unfortunately, Black people in the 21st century are still having to push back against old, traditional, racist counter narratives for demands for liberty, contextualized, of course, in this 21st century global information age culture. So I mean, a lot has changed, but a lot has not, I guess, is how I would put a label on it.
Yeah.
I also think
Ube, you got to yell at us again.
okay. I also think, and it's I think it goes back to my other point of like, we are desiring something to call this so we can talk about it later, right? So we can pick leaders, we can pick points of entry, we can pick a dialogue. But what that does, again, is it narrows the scope of what this whole moment is, right? Mm-hmm. I've been seeing a lot online of like, yeah, okay, so we can talk about Minnesota, but this really started with Ferguson, or, okay, we can talk about Ferguson, but this really started in Florida. Okay, we can talk about that, but then we can go back to Oakland, and talk about Oscar Grant. And then, okay, but if we talk about that, we got to talk about, Sean Bell. And again, what that does is it lessens the rich history and rich tradition that is so much bigger than this moment. And I think the sort of like desire to do that again comes from like, first of all, we want to give you evidence. Like, hey, look at all these places where this shit has happened, right? Second of all, we want to be able to talk about it and tell stories. But again, what that's going to do is it's going to erase all of the people and places, one, that we will never have names for. We will never be able to trace what exactly happened there. And two, it desires this sort of like Enlightenment movement idea of A, political change, but B, political leadership, right? Where we have to host, some kind, or bring forth some kind of starter. We have to bring forth some entryway, some beginning. And, I mean, as a social scientist, we love that shit. We're like, okay, beginning and end, deal. That's the thing we gotta study, right? We love that. We get off on that. But the reality is there are people who will continue to be impacted by this sort of state-sanctioned violence. There are people that will continue to be impacted by the political regime. There are people on the line where that state is pushing forward. The people on that line we're never going to hear about. And I think that, this really challenges us to have a better way to tell stories, right? A better way to give people our history that isn't just this one person over here, that one person over there, as if they're not connected or as if they're not a part of something larger.
Mm-hmm.
I think like where we are, and hopefully this is a nice compliment to what Dr. Wright and Dr. Jones have both offered us.
Wait.
No, you're Dr. Jones.
You're Dr.
Let him take it.
I'm the law here.
But I believe where we are is in the next step to Black liberation. Keean-Giamata Taylor has a wonderful book called From Black Lives Matter to Black Liberation. And one of the points that she tries to underscore is this thing that, Black Lives Matter is like this next glimmer in getting us to Black liberation. And what I want us to understand this moment as a people is that we are in continuity with what took place when we started off on the west coast of Africa and various other places and moved across the Atlantic, right? There were moments of refusal, right? all along those paths, from the plantation to freedom, etc., and coming right on through. And we are in that rich legacy. We are in that moment. So what this represents is that the next moment of that Black spirit trying to rise up and get us to liberation. Because this joint that we are living in was never meant for us. And what we have to understand, I believe, as a people is, how deeply invested are we in this? And what are you willing to give up to get to the place of liberation, right? We're going to have to be willing to give up certain things to get back to that place. Because as people have always said, this system is operating as intended. What we have to do is we have to pick up, and not to sound what people will call hotepish, right? But we have to pick up the tools of our ancestors, right? And continue that radical, rich history of refusal, right? When folks were in the fields, folks weren't just down there like getting cotton for master, if you will. What were we doing? We were breaking hoes, right? We were breaking other gardening tools. We were putting holes in cotton bags. Do you understand what I'm saying? These were moments of resistance. When the master of the plantation went in there, right? And I want to break up this while I'm here on this subject, right? There, we talk about the field Negro and the house Negro, not understanding that those within the house suffered high levels of trauma. Right? So when master went in there, right, to rape Black women, and we know this happened repeatedly, but he didn't know that he was going to go in there, right, and get stabbed in the neck, right? What I'm saying is that our present moment, our very present moment, is representative of all of these glimmers and instances of refusal. That is where we are at right now. And if you time it and we understand what is going on, then we understand the next steps that we need to take. We might need to go ahead and deploy that Haiti. But what we have to also understand is that in looking to Haiti, what Haiti also teaches us is that when we seek to liberate ourselves, blood is going to be shed on both sides of the battle, right? And we have had a lot of blood shed, but it might just be getting to the point to where that might happen again, because I truly think we are at the beginning of this. And yes, things are quote unquote peaceful and quiet now, but what you also have to understand is history. In the moment that we're actually talking now, things are peaceful and quiet with these protests, right? But things are always quiet when we are observing the life of the fallen. They are always quiet. Check your history for what comes after the mourning period. And that's where we are.
Yeah. I was looking recently at the history of Oscar Grant, right? And what I had to be reminded about, a lot of folks know about some of the original protests around January 7th, but what the history of Oscar Grant shows us is some of the most, I don't know, I guess some of the most intense protests came around January 30th and January 14th, much later on, right? And so I think people are seeing what's happening now, but again, folks have kind of forgotten the ways and the cycles that these movements take. Yeah, I mean, what's later to come, I think more and more is just going to build for sure.
Absolutely.
Can I add to that too, that we should, like past history tells us, perhaps expect, backlash, counter movements. So, one thing that I study in my own research is the pro-segregationist, anti-civil rights movement that it called itself massive resistance that was made up of business elites, political elites. There was a grassroots aspect to it as well that, of course, included the KKK. Many people are not familiar with the KKK during the Civil Rights era were not the most influential grassroots pro-segregationist organizations. It was actually initially called the White Citizens Council. They dropped the white part to make themselves sound more palatable to mainstream American, sort of media consumption. It became just the Citizens Council. But, they were effective in harassing civil rights activists, civil rights organization, under the pretext of there was communist infiltration into Black Southern protest, that Black people themselves are actually quite content with segregation. There's a harmonious relationship between whites and Blacks. Blacks understand their place. And what's really going on is there's a foreign conspiracy orchestrated by Moscow communists, taking place in the South to stir up the otherwise completely content, happy, passive Negro. I wouldn't be surprised if in the 21st century, maybe some international dimension to it, but of course, some domestic, aspect to a counter BLM. I mean, we've actually already seen a successful counter narrative against Black Lives Matter by way of Fox News. Fox News, I try to encourage people to spend time watching Fox News. It's irritating, it's annoying, it's disgusting, but you get a sense of how counter protests on the side of conservative right-wing media organizations mobilize ideology, white supremacist ideology, nonetheless, in a way that's sort of watered down, packaged in a way that is more consumptive for mainstream Americans, to the degree that people who might have previously agreed with the messaging of Black Lives Matter find themselves saying, yeah, you know what? Fox News, that segment by Bill O'Reilly, Sean Hannity, whomever, Laura Ingraham, yeah, they are kind of right. Black Lives Matter, that was wrong. So there's a very sophisticated counter media messaging that has gone on since the abolitionist era in the United States, where Southern elites described similarly Black slave revolts as inauthentic, that instead white Yankee Northerners were inspiring the otherwise passive, content, happy Negro slaves to engage in something that was unnatural. Like, it was not natural for slaves to demand freedom and liberty. Instead, white Northern activists like William Lloyd Garrison were stirring up Negroes, just as white Jewish recent immigrants to the United States who had previously been exposed to socialism were stirring up otherwise passive Negroes in the South. So I wouldn't be surprised if in the 21st century you see a similar kind of a sophisticated, counter-political messaging against, if you want to call it Black Lives Matter or whatever you want to classify this current mode of protest is.
I mean, right, and we've already seen it, right? Like the frame of the outside agitator, I think, is something that the narrative is already taking up really big, right? But it also discounts the fact that, like, folks are really fed up and tired, right? And so, oh no, it's these outside agitators that are coming in, and that this sort of rage can't be homegrown. I think we're already seeing the media, particularly Fox, and just all forms of mainstream media taking on this outside agitator frame. So.
Yeah, I mean, and I kind of want to, sorry, Sophie. I want to emphasize that this is a reaction to structural violence, but this is also a reaction to the very everyday life violence that Black people experience. This has always been the case. A lot of people's framings around the Great Migration to northern cities was that this was sort of for factory jobs or socioeconomic conditions. While that's true, it was because of lynch mobs and white violence that was ensuing and sort of heightening, right? And so at this moment in time, the same thing is happening with vigilante violence, with police violence. So make no mistake, this is also a reaction to that, to those types of everyday violence, right? And so we shouldn't lose sight of that, because again, with there being this tendency for white social movements, especially, to sort of reframe any particular Black movement as sort of passive, as sort of reactionary to conditions. A big part of that is also the everyday interpersonal violence that Black people have to endure and experience.
Yeah. I think you spoke to this, so I'm glad you went first. But one of the things that I've seen people really struggling with on my social media feeds is how to distinguish between who is taking the physical act. So, for example, folks are struggling to distinguish between, like, cops who enact violence on protesters as, part of the narrative of constructing, a violent protest, versus some folks, are really worried about people unaffiliated with protests coming in and causing violence that will be attributed to movements, versus like intentional actions that are rooted in community knowledge and community strategies. I've seen, those three things are just conflated, Steph, kind of like you were alluding to earlier, into this dichotomy. And for folks at home, like, that means an either or choice. where it's either these three things, it's one of these three groups causing a fuss for some reason, or it's peaceful, right? And we have to detangle where this act is coming from and allow ourselves to really just rest in the complexity of it, I think.
Y'all hear me okay? Is my voice, can y'all hear me?
Keep yelling.
Okay, good. I'm yelling. I really am yelling. Okay.
Now you sound like you're yelling, but we just still hear you at a normal volume.
I'm just like nervous. My neighbors, I mean, they hear me talk like this all the time, but I'm just like, oh.
They're getting a free PhD.
Yes, they are. So I'm gonna be real careful as I say this, because I think that when people hear this, they misinterpret what this means. I think the point that you're getting at, Sophie, is a real misdirection, because it points to this, like, let's like focus on policing, police action in this very like insular way. And I think what disturbs me the most about that conversation is that that's not really how Black activists are talking about this, right? Yes, we can talk about this individual officer, these individual officers, and what happens to them. That's an important part of the conversation, but it's not the whole story, right? And I think that when people get arrested or when they get charged, when these officers, you know, when they're like, okay, look, justice is going to be served. We locked your boy up. Isn't that what you wanted? You know, going back to Oscar Grant, I think, you know, Medgley was charged with manslaughter and convicted. And people were like, y'all happy? And people were like, no, no, that didn't make us happy, right? And we can, you know, even refer to a bunch of other names, a bunch of other, you know, officers that were involved in Black killings, right? Because this didn't change the dynamic. And
exactly.
I think when we focus on, okay, like these police officers are being violent, and that's going to define how we talk about the protest, but not the opening or really redefining of what policing is, which is really what people keep trying to bring the conversation back to. Yes, these individual instances of what people like to call police brutality, but I walk away from that term. These individual instances add on to what is the larger story that policing is getting more and more dangerous. The job of policing is getting dangerous. The inactions that people have to commit to be a part of a policing body, right, is becoming more and more dangerous, more and more violent. And until we change the infrastructure of how people are instructed to police, right, never forget, police don't send themselves out into your neighborhood, right? Someone sent those folks there. And the question is, why? Why did they send them over here? Why didn't they go that way, right? Why are these kinds of actions sanctioned by the state? Why are these kinds of actions sanctioned by elites and powerful people who get to determine what policing is? Why do we continue to fund police in the way that we do, right? Police officers can only request tanks. They don't build them. So how is it that all these policing bodies have tanks and tons of war equipment, but we can't even get hospital people masks, right? What are the kinds of imbalances that we have that it contribute to the dynamics of policing, right? The way people are instructed to police. That's what the conversation has to come back to. And when we're talking about these individual protests, I mean, again, yes, we can talk about these individual officers that are involved in this individual protest, but they are being instructed to police neighborhoods the same way military officers are instructed to police, you know, agents in which we're at war with, right? Countries where we're at war. And that is critical. I mean, I can't drive that home enough. That is critical, and it's really central to the conversation that we've been having But I feel like a lot of times we have to shift the conversation around, because the people who want to talk about it really just want to reflect on this small instance so that we can all go home, right? They want to reflect on these individual people so that we can all go home. But I mean, I also think that we have to remember that, I mean, I was looking at when the military got deployed, right? When the National Guard came in. These are people who like signed up to protect their country. And now they're running through these neighborhoods. I mean, the neighborhoods that they themselves may have to return to one day, right? And I can only imagine the cognitive dissonance. You went through all this training, all learning all these skills to try and protect American ideals and American soil. And now you're on that soil, that same soil, to try and fuck up a neighborhood, right? And it's a part of these, what Dylan Rodriguez refers to as these sort of inhumane positions that we put people in to defend the objects of the state, right? Put them in to defend, again, this continuing push of the line of how policing is even instructed to be had.
Can I add on to that? An institutionalized hierarchy of sanctioned violence is perhaps the way that we should better understand policing. As you said, you want to move away from focusing on individual acts of so-called police brutality and understand that there is a complex matrix of cultural practices that make it possible for these routine acts of violence to happen. Also, let me add to that, at the level of ideology, white supremacist ideology in particular, one must appreciate there's a long history of equating blackness with criminality, with savagery, with existing outside of the law, and therefore the law must be imposed upon blackness. Black people cannot control themselves was the ideology that justified slavery, which is an ideology that is still with us today in the 21st century. And therefore, as you asked in your question, why are police focused on this particular community as opposed to that one? Because there is an erroneous belief that more crime is happening in communities of color, and therefore harsher policing needs to be targeted on those communities.
And a belief that's produced daily, right? Through institutions that aren't necessarily directly involved with policing, right? I mean, you bring up Fox News. We can talk about media outlets that continue to try and affirm that criminality and blackness are inherently linked.
I feel like that summarizes the day. Like, I just kind of want to be like, all right, y'all, and we're going home. Now that we got to the core of what we actually brought you here for, we've reached through all the layers. I do know that we have kept folks on a little bit longer than we planned, but honestly, that's how our group works. We could go on for hours, y'all. I
was gonna be like really petty and be like, so Steph, how do you feel about abolition versus 8 can't wait? How you feel about that hot dialogue?
We ain't got enough time to unpack that. We ain't got enough time.
All on our page today.
Let's go. I mean, we here. Let's go.
Okay, let's actually do that. Let's deviate from the agenda for a moment. I want us to take the concepts that we just rammed people through and give them a tangible example that's in front of them. People are making choices about where to put their money, where to put their effort, where to put their recommendations, right? All of us on our social media feeds are trusted by the folks who follow us. So if we said, you should donate to 8 Can't Wait, you bet somebody's donating there, right? So very briefly, what's going on with 8 Can't Wait and why can't it wait?
Jazz.
Oh, why I gotta take it on? Look, there is a policy platform that is out there.
Oh, some haters.
I'm just saying, my homie put a hot take out there that, sometimes dynamics do not change.
Wow.
And what we're really trying to do is redefine what policing is, right? So I'm just throwing it out there, you know? Does that jive? Does this view of, hey, we want to dynamics and redefining of policing line up with this, you know, defund police, or let's do de-escalation tactics, right? Like, does that actually get to what I think Professor Jones is pointing us to?
Wow. Okay. Professor
I mean, you are a professor. You are a professor.
You're a professor.
Or professor.
Yeah.
She's also my advisor, y'all, for being honest.
Held against my will. No, okay. So I always lean on the survival pending revolution, right? Which is just an old, I mean, I'm from Oakland, Black Panther tradition runs through my veins. So survival pending revolution. Ruth Wilson Gilmore actually gave a talk where she was like, I want to reframe this to survival pending abolition, right? And so I am not bothered by these it can't wait campaigns and defund the police campaigns. I'm not bothered by them. I just want people to understand that that's not what we're asking for, right? I want people to understand that that's not the end point. Like, yes, until the revolution, we should feed people. until the revolution, right? We gotta live our lives. We gotta do these things until the revolution, until abolition is, if we are ready for abolition and it is here, we have to survive. And so I'm less bothered by these types of campaigns. I get more frustrated when people are like, well, then we're good, right? I did that thing. And again, I think it goes back to, I know that I keep saying this, so sorry that I keep hitting this nail, but it goes back to the way that we allow ourselves to tell stories, right? We can position ourselves to be like, great, I took care of the Ferguson moment when it came. Great. I took care of the Oscar Grant moment when it came. Great. I took care of the Minnesota moment, which I'm sure this will be framed by, as I was here. But after these moments disappear, and let's recognize it only disappears for some folks, right? There are plenty of communities that are continuing to deal with police atrocities and state-sanctioned violence every day. But part of this narrative that we give ourselves allows us to walk away at some point. And I keep I keep that frame in my mind constantly. It motivates my work. And I think that until we are able to like stomach the fact that something big has to happen for us to get what we're asking for, right? Something else has to be put in place, which means that we have to allow ourselves to imagine that something else. Chaz is picking on me because I give this frame to my students all the time, right? I ask them and I'm like, imagine how the world ends. Like, think to yourself, how does the world end? And they'll be like, oh, aliens are coming. Cool. It's going to be a pandemic. Cool. The icebergs will melt and we'll all be underwater. And I'm like, cool, great. Give me some more reasons. And they'll throw out reasons of like how the world, the planet itself will end. Human existence will cease. And then I ask them, okay, how does capitalism end? And the room always goes silent, right? No one ever has anything to say because they cannot even imagine how that plays out. They can't imagine. And I would argue, and I'm sure people, no matter how you sit on capitalism, would agree, capitalism has been around in a shorter period than the world, right? So if we're talking about something being more stable than human existence, a system that we're doing to ourselves can't be that thing, right? When we talk about prison abolition, people can't even imagine it. It's not even that they need to be convinced, right? Or persuaded, or like if we just give them enough detail, we can argue and they'll come over to our side. It's like, I can't even imagine what a world looks like without this institution. But this institution is less than 100 years old. Like, it's not even, it hasn't even been around for all of human existence, right? And especially in the way that we see policing now. This is fresh, this is new. But people can't imagine what's on the other side of policing.
Right.
So the point is, capitalism will outlive planet Earth.
It has to. Because you can't imagine the opposite, right? The aliens are coming. They're going to be like, let's become, Jeff Bezos. Like, yes, let's run Amazon. That's the move from the aliens, right?
I wasn't expecting to end on an alien note.
It must be the devil.
It must be the devil.
It must be the devil. Can't be Rockefeller.
Can't be Rockefeller. It can't be Donald Trump. It can't be Diamond.
All right, y'all. We've entered the roast session of our talks. I got to round us up for a minute. All right, everybody. This was a lot, and I'm sure that it was hard to write down every historical reference and name and text that you didn't, that you're not familiar with. So I encourage you to take this in chunks if you need to. That's fine. One of the things that I think has been thematic through every answer is how much we do not know. And that's really hard when we have to make day by day, sometimes hour by hour decisions about how to support Black movements, Black scholars, right? And the big problem is that we don't know history. We don't know how to put language to the power dynamics at play, right? To go back to our original question, what is the political change that we seek? And we have to think broadly. This whole thing has been about challenging our imagination in a way, right? You have to think big. This is a big shift people are asking for, which is why there's all these demands going in different ways, and it's hard to keep track of what cities are doing because every city's got its own thing. And again, to reiterate, as we've talked about in various histories of social movements, every community has its reason. There is a logic that might not be codified in our history, that might not be preserved in our history, but also remember that abolition is partly an archival project. And what I mean by that is we have to pay attention in order to challenge that historical erasure, right? We have to remember the logics of our movements right now, right? Because this is how we use the next step, Antwann, as you said, right? The next step of BLM that BLM has provided for us. This is how we continue that momentum. And so even though, we're grappling with, it's complicated. How do you decide when something is a riot versus an uprising? And like, when does violence matter? What I'm hoping that folks are taking from this is that there's a bigger question to ask. There's a lot of bigger questions to ask. And mainly they have to do with how society is set up, because all of those things come together to help us contextualize and understand the basic meanings. And for those of us who are non-Black, we have participated in historical erasure. We are blind to it in many ways, right? There are archives we will never be able to put together, right? They are gone. We are injecting our opinions where they do not matter, right? And so this is a specific call to be uncomfortable and to rely on the folks that I have brought together today, because they know their shit. Like, to put it bluntly, like, y'all have been working for such a long time to really bring this knowledge to folks. And so if there was something people were uncomfortable with, again, I invite you to sit with it. I invite you to reflect and revisit it, because this movement, as you've seen, is not just today, right? This everything is connected to everything. You got to go, right? As Steph said, you got to go back to Orlando, and you got to go back to all these cities, and it's connected. And law is just one piece of that. All these legal changes we're pushing for, like, I'm not saying don't do it. I'm not saying it's not important. I'm saying remember to think big and connect the dots. And so if you are struggling to work through, all these reading lists that are flying around, that is understandable, right? There's a lot going on and you are ingesting a lot of information, but that doesn't mean that you deserve to be comfortable through this process. This is going to be tough, and it's what it has to be. Because as you can see, these communities have logics, and these scholars are working so hard to make sure that we preserve and continue and build on this knowledge. And so I really want to thank y'all. As I mentioned at the beginning, like, you all are my teachers. You all are folks that I collaborate with to challenge myself. Like, I go to law school. Y'all know how much law school tries to really make you love the Constitution. They're like, yes, it's the best. We're going to make you take 2 classes on it. So thank you all, not just for the knowledge you've shared with me, but with, roughly 600 folks, maybe more, who knows. And for everyone at home, this is just the first conversation. This is just the first conversation. And we thank you for being willing to engage and be uncomfortable, and for sitting through us roasting each other for 2 hours. It's 2:19 for us, and so it's exactly on the dot of 2 hours. So we gave everybody the little half-hour bonus. All right. So thanks, everyone. Continue the work, continue learning, and thanks for coming today.
Thank y'all so much. Thank you, Sophie, for organizing.
Don't talk about me.
Yes, thank you, Sophie.
Y'all.
I'm going. We're leaving.